With Ralph Langer, and he's going to tell us about his experience in the Navy during the 50s, especially as it relates to his service on the DEW line. Ralph, can you fill us in?
Yeah, Jerry, happy to. Graduated college in June of 1956, and by the end of July, the next month, I was at Navy OCS in Newport, Rhode Island. And after 4 months there, I was commissioned, I remember the date, it was October 12th, 1956, and had immediate orders to Jacksonville, Florida, to Navy Aviation Ground Officer School, where they instruct you on the ins and outs and various aspects of Navy Air. And I had been selected in a competition at OCS for a mysterious naval air program that was just starting up. And after 2 months at Jacksonville, I was sent to, had orders to San Diego for further assignment, and in between Jacksonville and San Diego, I got married to a girl who I had met in college and had been engaged to for about 6 months. The minute I got to San Diego, I was further assigned to go to San Francisco for transportation to Hawaii, which I did. When I got to Hawaii, I was assigned to a new squadron that was starting up called Airborne Early Warning Squadron 12, based on in Barbers Point Naval Air Station on Oahu. On arriving there, I was told that I was going to be a navigator in a Airborne Early Warning Squadron crew, which Airborne Early Warning, otherwise known as the Distant Early Warning or DEW line. And this was an operation that, as I said, was just beginning, and it turned out that it was a continuation of what the Air Force was doing over Canada. They had the DEW line going over Canada, and there was a DEW line and the Pine Tree line. I think the Pine Tree line was land-based radar stations, whereas Air Force crews were flying over Canada itself. Now, the extension of the DEW line over the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans came as what I believe was a result of the Soviet Union extending the range of some of its aircraft, so that rather than attacking the US, if they were so inclined, over Canada, they could now do an end run over the Pacific and the Atlantic. So since it was ocean, the Navy lobbied for the job and thereby got started on a program that resulted in the Navy's Airborne Early Warning program. Now, when I got to Hawaii, I had no training or no particular knowledge of aviation navigation. So we were instructed for a couple of months in a ground school, and then I was assigned to an Air Force squadron. The Air Force squadron was flying, it was a military air transport squadron, and that's where, when you hear that you join the Navy and see the world, that's where I saw a good part of the world. And I flew with an Air Force crew, learning on the job with an Air Force navigator, got to Japan, got to the Philippines, and most of the islands in between. Particularly interesting was getting to Eniwetok and Kwajalein, where the A tests had taken place in the Pacific. But after a couple of months of on-the-job training with the Air Force, I was assigned to a crew. Our crews consisted of about 22 men. We didn't have our own aircraft, but we had a lot of different aircraft. They were the same. It was the same plane. It was WV-2, otherwise known colloquially as a Willie Victor, and we had a lot of them on the base, and we trained for quite a long time. And the crews consisted of us 22 men, as I say, about 4 pilots, flight engineer, radio operator, navigator, me, 2 combat information center officers who were radar officers, and about 7 or 8 enlisted men who were radar scope watchers. And our job was to fly a racetrack pattern from Midway Island, which is about 1,200 miles east of the Hawaiian Islands, and just nothing more than an Air Force or Navy base with a couple of runways. And we would deploy our squadron from Barbers Point Naval Air Station out to Midway on an 18-day cycle. And from Midway, we would fly 8 flights north to the Aleutians. And we would fly a racetrack pattern, and the flights took approximately 15 hours. And on that track, for the couple of years or the year and a half that I was operating, there were about an average of 4.5 aircraft on that track. So we were constantly monitoring the skies and the ocean, looking for a potential Soviet attack on the mainland U.S. Now, underneath our flights were about stationed periodically. There were 3 or 4 destroyer escorts who were there ostensibly to help us with navigation. But for the most part, we were helping them with navigation, because they would tell us as we flew over them that they were mostly just bouncing around on the surface of the ocean. I remember one crew of the ship telling us that they hadn't been able to cook anything for a couple of days because all they were doing was bouncing and all they could eat was sandwiches. So we were drinking coffee and having our own sandwiches up above them, but we were only up there for 15 hours. And it was a very interesting operation. As the navigator, I was responsible for setting the headings, telling the pilots. It was kind of blind obedience from the pilots to the navigator, because the pilots were looking out mostly into fog. They couldn't see anything because we could not get the aircraft above 12,000 feet, and 12,000 feet was mostly in that area of the world all socked in. And on the way back, when we had less fuel, we could get a little bit higher. But being a navigator on that kind of an operation was somewhat difficult, in that you would lose Midway Island, which has an elevation of about 8 feet. You would lose them on radar less than 100 miles away. And then you were dead reckoning for much of the time, unless you could get a clear sky where you could use your sextant and shoot the sun lines and the moon lines, and if you were really fortunate, you could shoot the stars with your sextant and determine your location. The other navigational aid that we used very often was a drift meter, where we had, it was similar to the sextant where you look at the heavens, but this was a meter that you look through an eyepiece at the surface of the ocean, and you would navigate off the white caps that were always in place below you, and get a drift reading, and that helped you with your dead reckoning and helped you generally with your navigation. So I had to perform those functions. Also, I had to maintain the records of fuel, and I had to determine point of safe return to Midway and point of no return to Midway. And if there was a point of no return reached, then we had an aircraft problem. We'd have to go to our alternate airbase. And the primary alternate on our route was the Aleutian chain and the Navy base of Adak in the Aleutians. And fortunately for us, we only had to make that trip after we had passed the point of no return. We went into Adak, where we had to stay for a couple of days awaiting a part for the airplane. And Adak was simply a Navy station with a runway and some mechanics that could repair aircraft. And Adak was interesting in that it was a beautiful isolated area of the Aleutian chain. And during World War II, about 30,000 troops were stationed up there trying to prevent, if it happened, a land invasion by the Japanese onto Alaska and then on to the U.S. The Japanese never came, and the American troops that were up there didn't have an awful lot to do, and it was interesting going through some of these old Quonset huts, and you'd see the Betty Grable calendars, and you'd see the dates marked off, the guys keeping track of how much longer they had to stay up there. So that was interesting. But then Midway Island was interesting to us in that we had they had gorgeous beaches. We had snorkeling equipment. We did a lot of swimming. We played a lot of volleyball. We had USO troops come through to entertain us. So we had like, we'd fly the 14-hour flights, 14, 15-hour flights, 8 of them, and in between we went to the beach. Right. So it was fun out there. But then, because the DuLine project had many aircraft, and they were all the same. They were these Super Constellation aircraft with the same aircraft that you may remember that TWA flew and Eastern Airlines flew, the triple tails, 4 engines. Only the military version had the dome on the top, the radar dome on the top, and a hump on the bottom. And while the Air Force planes were silver, the Navy planes were dark gray. So there was the difference. You could tell who was Navy and who was Air Force. But after our 18-day deployment to Midway, we would generally go back to Barbers Point Naval Air Station in a picked-over version of the aircraft, because the mechanics on Midway needed the parts to keep all the other airplanes flying. So I would navigate back from Midway, the 1,200 miles back to Oahu. I would navigate back basically island hopping. There were a lot of reefs in between Midway and the Hawaiian Islands. And I just recently saw that a hurricane out in that area wiped out one of our primary island hopping.
Really?
Yeah, island hopping atolls. They were unpopulated, all of them. But French Frigate Shoals is what it was called. And they were about halfway between, so you'd fly to French Frigate Shoals and then some other reefs and then on into Barbers Point. So actually, I got there in the very beginning of this project, and we trained for about 1.5 years, flying mostly around the Hawaiian Islands and side trips up to Alaska and a few other areas. And for the year and a half that we trained, everybody was getting ready for the startup of this operation officially. And that happened, I believe that happened in the beginning of 1957. And, or maybe it was halfway into 1957. Then I was operational on my crew until the latter part of 1959, when I was released from active duty to go to law school, which I never did, but I fully intended to.
Yeah.
I already had 2 babies born in Hawaii, and it was just too difficult to prospect. One of my daughters was born in the territory of Hawaii, and this younger one, year and a half younger, was born in the state of Hawaii. Hawaii became a state while we were there, and it was one of the wildest, most fun celebrations that I've ever gone through. But anyway, I was released from active duty in July or August of 1959, and while I had a reserve obligation of a few years, I went back to New York, which was my home, and the nearest Naval Air Station was Floyd Bennett Field in Queens, and I went there and checked in dutifully, and the officer of the day who I checked in with asked me what my designator was. Every naval officer has a designator of one kind or another. And when I told him my designator was 1355, he says, "Huh, what's that?" I said, "That's an aerial navigator." He says, "I don't know about that designator." I said, "Can I speak to the commanding officer of the base?" And he said, "Sure." So I went and spoke to the commanding officer, and he had the same reaction.
Yeah.
Huh? So he said, "Well, we don't have any aircraft here at Floyd Bennett that requires navigators." So I said, "Well, what am I supposed to do?" He says, "Just let us know where you are. Go home and check in periodically with us," which I did. And after a few years, it was requested that I resign my commission, which I did.
Yeah.
The rest is the rest of my life.
Yeah. You had a year and a half of training before you started to.
Yeah.
What was the training? Primarily navigation and timing?
It was navigation and just getting the crews to function, to function in a coordinated way.
Right.
Yes. The pilots getting used to the airplane, the CIC officers getting used to their crews, and me navigating us around.
Now, your CIC officers would become active if you saw something. That's primarily the only time they would be.
We were looking for Soviet subs and Soviet aircraft, obviously, and we never saw any that I can recall.
So you covered a space between the Earth and the sea in 12,000 feet?
10 to 12,000. We take off and climb to 10,000 feet, go north to within 100 miles or 150 miles or so of ADAC and the Aleutians, turn around and fly back. And as we flew back with less fuel, we could go a little higher and sometimes get out of the soup that we're usually flying in. But it was interesting because my plane commander was a full commander, full Navy commander, which is equivalent, I think, of a colonel.
Right.
Yeah. And most of the pilots were junior pilots. Some were full lieutenants. But a lot of us were lieutenant junior grade, which you get to be automatically JG after 18 months if you hadn't done anything big.
Right.
So they were getting used to each other. The pilots were getting used to the airplane. The flight engineer we were all getting ready for this operation.
Right.
And then we became operational, as far as I was concerned, for about a year and a half. I logged about 2,000 hours in that airplane. And what was also interesting was that not long after I left the service, or left active duty, the whole operation only lasted not that many more years. I left in 1959. I think they closed it down in about 1965.
I think I read that.
So the whole operation was operational for less than 10 years.
Right.
And when they cranked it up, starting in late 1955, it only lasted 10 years. So it was a here and a gone military operation, and I was involved in it simply because I was my
You were
time.
there.
My timing.
It became obsolete because of the improvement in radar technology. So
I think that was a big
I
big
think
part
I read
of it.
that.
And
Yeah.
I think it was also Vietnam was starting to crank up,
Yeah.
and Cuba was.
Yep.
I thought, because the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think, took place in about 1963, and I thought I might be called back, but I never was.
Right.
And then that went away, and maybe I don't specifically know the history of the politics, but maybe we were a little less concerned about the Soviets at that time, more
Right.
concerned about Vietnam starting up.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the history of it, which means it was here today and gone tomorrow, the entire operation.
It was, but it would seem to me that, given the nature of your tour, there must have been a closeness and esprit de corps with you guys. You spent so much time together, an abnormal amount, I would think.
I think it was abnormal. Well, one of the aspects of it, we had a tremendous number of junior officers, guys that had just come out of OCS and flight training and the various aspects. The Combat Information Center officers were young guys.
Yeah.
And we all lived together. We had government housing at Pearl Harbor, and we drive out to Barbers Point every morning and check in, meet and do whatever we were doing for the day. And but we all lived together. And Hawaii in those days, Hawaii in the 60s. In the 50s, rather, was one big military installation. You had Air Force, you had Marines, you had Navy, all over the place. And for officers, it was a lot of fun because there were officers' clubs all over the place.
Yep.
We spent, in the 18 days we were back at Barbers Point and not on Midway, if we weren't doing training flights, we were at the beach or on the golf course. I look back on it as being terrific duty.
Yeah.
Having my wife there, having my daughters born there. It was. Some guys, most guys in the military, it's not fun, but I had fun.
Right. Well, I'll give you the obligatory thank you for your service, but especially thank you for telling us about this. Most people wouldn't, especially now. It's far enough in the past. The DEW line's part of history. And it's neat to talk to somebody that participated in it.
Yeah, because there aren't too many of us.
No.
Yeah, now you mentioned esprit de corps. We did have that, obviously, and we've had some reunions since. And I think most of the guys have faded away. I don't know when I went to the first reunion, which was in Maryland. And it was great seeing the guys again. That was a number of years after we had gone inactive. But and then they had another, at least one more reunion out in the Midwest that I couldn't get to. Then they started up a museum where they had one of our aircraft at this museum, and the guys that had been the mechanics were putting this aircraft back together because it was all almost in pieces. But they redid the entire interior, and I think the last reunion they had with the one that I did not attend was held where that aircraft and museum were located. And I was proud to, I found online a sextant, the same sextant that I had used and carried with me. You know, we had a navigation bag, and in the navigation bag we carried our sextant, we carried certain other tools, and we carried the Air Almanac and a volume called HO 214. Now, I used to have copies of them, but over the 50 or 60 years since then, I've lost track of them. But the HO 214 in combination with the Air Almanac, you could pinpoint any place on the globe. And those were the calculations that you cranked into your sextant. You'd find a star, you'd find the sun, if you could see the sun, or the moon at night. And the other aspect of navigation in those days was Loran. We had rudimentary Loran.
Did you?
You could only pick it up at night because it was coming out of various bases miles and miles away. So you could pick up a Loran line at night. You could never get it during the day where we were flying, because we flew between Midway and the Aleutians. There was nothing. It was just ocean. And so Loran is a lot better, or obviously a lot better now, and so is radar. So those were, so it was radar for a while, Loran, sextant, drift sight, dead reckoning. Those are the navigation skills that you had to have. And
great.
Yeah. So you know, I was proud to have been in it, proud to have served, and that's my story.
Well, very good. Thank you very much for taking the time.
My pleasure.
Okay.